So good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, I'd like to welcome you to the Regional Summit on Making Apprenticeships Work. My name is Theresa Singleton. I am a Senior Vice President and Community Affairs Officer here at the bank in the Community Development and Regional Outreach Department. I want to start off by thanking all of the state and federal partners who've helped to make this conference what you see in the agenda, working in collaboration with our colleague Keith Rowland. I think we put together not only a great apprenticeship guide update, but also a wonderful agenda that I'm so excited to walk through with you here today. So yesterday, when I was trying to get my mind around today's event, I had two questions in my mind, and I did not want to go to Keith and have a 2-hour conversation about this. But I had the question, how do people learn about apprenticeships, and how widespread are they? And so I did what you should never do. I Googled it. And I got caught in that rabbit hole of Google. And what I did is I put in the term paid apprenticeships in Google. And it took me to Indeed, and I found over 6,000 paid apprenticeship references in Indeed. And I was shocked. I want to say to our IT department, if you are here, if you're watching, I was not looking for a job opportunity for myself, but I was struck by the breadth of opportunities that presented themselves in this search. Apprenticeships can afford a wide array of opportunities, and I was just taken by the fact that they were among these 6,000 positions. There were people who were obviously looking for people to apply for apprenticeships, but there were also job postings that were stating that they were looking for people who had skills that they had developed through apprenticeships. They were positions located in small towns in California, cities in Kentucky. There were positions that ranged from less formal, more earn as you learn or learn as you earn type positions to more formal structured apprenticeships. And there were also a broad array of industries and opportunities in terms of types of work. So there were those that you typically see, like plumbers apprenticeships. There were also mechanics apprenticeships, but there were also some that were less typical. The Department of Treasury had an apprenticeship position available for a letter and script engraver for banknotes. So if you want to learn how to make dollar bills, there's an apprenticeship for that. And so I was just completely caught up in looking at the different types of opportunities that were available across the country. And so two additional questions kind of came to mind for today. Obviously, if you're going to get this broad array of opportunities, you need a lot of collaboration and cooperation across employers, trainers, educators, and government stakeholders. So the first question was, how do we facilitate these partnerships that are evidently needed? And the second question was really around regions. How do regional job markets shape the creation and the innovation that we need to create and sustain programs like apprenticeships? And so these are two of the questions that I'm hoping that we're going to explore, and there will be a broad array of others. I'm glad that we have such a great cross-section of stakeholders from the 3 states in our district, from Washington, D.C., and from Colorado to help us in this inquiry. Under Keith's guidance and leadership, we've designed today's conference to address these and a host of other questions, examining apprenticeships in both traditional and non-traditional fields, as well as new programs that are being created in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. We've asked speakers from across our 3 states to emphasize the lessons learned from their experience and to highlight their strengths and accomplishments. And I think most importantly, we've also asked them to share the challenges and the issues that they've had in creating these programs, because we feel like it's in those challenges that we all can learn. Lastly, we've also updated our apprenticeship guide, which provides more in-depth descriptions of these new and emerging programs. And importantly, it creates or shares a lot of contact information for people and programs that can be resources for you in the future. So some of you who are not really familiar with the Federal Reserve may be asking yourselves, why is the Fed interested in apprenticeships and in workforce development? And so we usually start off with a reminder of our dual mandate. And Rio is here, and he's from our economics department, and he can talk to you about the dual mandate and why the Fed cares about maximum employment. I can speak to this from a community development standpoint. And for us, we are committed to promoting job equity. This is a core goal of our department, and we believe that apprenticeships can provide a critical pathway to job equity. Whether it's through our research like opportunity occupations or convening such as these, we want to contribute to building a workforce ecosystem that meets people where they are, that invests in promising strategies, and that connect workers to quality jobs. We believe that apprenticeships are clearly a strategy that helps us meet all of those objectives. If you're interested in learning more about job equity and how local communities can promote and create opportunities in this space, we invite you to please join us at our Reinventing Conference, and there's a postcard at each of your desks. The conference is being held here in Philadelphia, May 27th through 29th, and we'll bring together more than 500 stakeholders from across the country, academics and practitioners, who are really coming together to share local strategies on how to create housing, wealth, and job equity in our communities. So I want to thank you all again for your attendance and your participation in our conference today. We look forward to a robust dialogue with you and with our panelists and other presenters. And with that, I'm going to invite Ryotaro from our research department to come up and share with you an economic update.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Theresa, for that introduction. My name is Tashiro. I work in the research department here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. So when Keith invited me to speak at this event, he actually tasked me with providing you with some of the statistics that we're seeing in terms of labor market so that we can set the stage for the rest of the day, so no pressure, right? So for that, I actually went and picked several different topics so that we can get our conversation started. So I hope you find this interesting as well. However, before I can do any of that, I am required to start with a disclaimer, and that the views expressed this morning are my own. Apparently, if I say this, I can say whatever I want. Hopefully, I won't get into trouble. All right, so I'll be talking about some of the stuff that we're seeing in terms of what are some of the most in-demand skills and job vacancy duration, and then followed by some discussions about automation and regional employment. And finally, I want to spend a few minutes talking about what are some of the effects of retiring workers. And since I want this to be more of an interactive session rather than a lecture, so if people have questions, please don't hesitate to wait until the end. I'd love to answer questions throughout the presentation. So before I get into the my first topic, what I thought I would do is just to give you some background in terms of what we're seeing in terms of the labor market conditions. So by most metrics that we're seeing, we can actually confidently say that our labor market, for the most part, has been pretty strong and very solid, at least for the past couple of years or so. And that statement is certainly true for 2019. The latest data that we have is December 2019, and it does look like, for the most part, the communities around the three states that we cover here in the 3rd District of Federal Reserve, you do see that most communities went through some positive job growth over the last 12 months or so. Of course, you do see some pockets of communities where they went through negative job growth, indicated by the purple color. And those states, areas, tend to have higher manufacturing and also higher energy-related sectors. So, if those sectors are not doing so great, overall, it does look like, their local labor markets are also, not doing well. But I think overall, we tend to see this overall narrative that, our labor market has been strong, particularly around Philadelphia area. And when we look at the trend in terms of the sector for the past 30 years or so, we are seeing some interesting trends, particularly I think for this audience as well, right? So first of all, if you look at the red line, for example, which is the manufacturing sector, you do see that there has been some sharp decline in terms of the share of manufacturing sector over the past 30 years. So for example, back in January of 1990, the manufacturing sector accounted for more than 15% of our labor force, which, by the way, was the second largest sector in all of Philadelphia metropolitan area. Fast forward about 30 years, you can see that that red line has declined pretty sharply, and that the share of that particular sector now is a little bit less than 7%. So we do see this, a huge decline. However, if you look at the productivity for that particular sector, you see that there has been a huge increase. So what does this mean is that, we see that, this particular sector, first of all, has been changing a lot over the past 30 years. So, they are employing fewer people, but they're doing more. They're putting a lot more output with fewer people, which is why we're seeing this very interesting trend. On the other side, if you look at the green line, education and health service sector, which is at the top now, has been the one of the fastest growing, and also it also happens to be the largest sector in terms of the share of employment in the Philadelphia area. So I know the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts together both the education and health service together, but really what's driving this increase is the health providing sector. So these are jobs like nurses, dentists, doctors, etc. And those jobs have been really the key driver for our local labor market. So we are seeing this interesting trend of declining, very rapid decline in manufacturing, and at the same time we're seeing very rapid increase in the particularly the health providing sector. Another statistics that's important to show is the decline in unemployment rates at all levels, right? So if you look at the black line, for example, which is for the U.S., the unemployment rate has been declining pretty steadily since the last recession. We were at above 9% after the last recession. That has been declining pretty steadily, and the current numbers sits at 3.6%, hovering around the near 50% low. So again, when people ask me about how are our labor markets performing, I would say in general things are really good. So much so that when I talk to our business contacts, from our bank, we are starting to hear these complaints about if the labor market is so tight, meaning that the labor, if the unemployment rate is so low, people are starting to have issues with finding qualified applicants, which I do think that some of the topics that we'll be discussing later today, will be important to resolve some of these issues. So this brings me to actually my first topic for the day, which is what are some of the most in-demand jobs right now in the United States or locally, and what are some of the skills associated with it? And clearly, this is my a shameless promotion for my own research. So hopefully, you'll find this research interesting as well. So just to provide you with some more context, again, continuing with this topic of how firms are finding difficulty finding qualified applicants, you do see that if you look at some of the various surveys out there, we're starting to see much of the firms basically finding difficulty hiring people, right? So this is the survey of National Federation of Independent Business, and you can see that at least 50% of the respondents said that they're having some issues with hiring because they have been seeing few qualified applicants. So really, the questions that that we wanted to ask when we wrote this report was, what are some of the occupations that are actually causing it, and how are some of the job requirements affect time to fill? So what we did in this research is that we obtained a very large data set that includes almost near universe of all online job ads posted in the United States between 2015 and 2017. So using this data set, we can actually literally see what are some of the jobs that are basically most in demand, and what are some of the skills associated with it. And nice thing about this particular data set is that not only it has the the job titles and the locations, but it also has various requirements associated with that particular posting. So we can actually sort of do some analysis on what are some of the effects of asking for, say, more higher degrees or more years of experience. How does that relate to the outcome in terms of time to fill? So what I thought I would do is first of all to show you some of the sort of most in-demand jobs out there back in 2017, and clearly some of the sectors I mentioned a minute ago, from the the health service providing sector, make up some of the top 10 of the list. But what's actually interesting is that if you actually look across these tables, you see that there are actually very little variation in terms of the geographic differences between what's actually being demanded, right? So if you look at the blue table for the United States and compare that to the Philadelphia MSA, some of the most in-demand jobs are actually almost identical. Registered nurse, are either number 1 or number 2 at all levels because of the increase in the demand for warehousing and transportation sector, because of the increase in e-commerce sector. You do see the truck drivers, being heavily demanded in all areas of the United States. Just to see some, to show you some interesting data, I also compiled a list of, what are some of the top skill requirements. So this is basically in addition to the degree and experience requirements. If you think to a typical job ad, you can see that, at the bottom, most job ads actually have, we want, in addition to your degree and experience, we want such and such skills. So we did a simple list of, in terms of frequency. And what's interesting here is that, when we think about skill requirements, it's really easy to think about technical skills. When we talk about the jobs that we have, for example, in our research department, we often like to talk about computer skills like different computer language programs like R, Stata, and Python, etc. But if you look at the data, you can see that what's really important here in terms of skill requirements is actually the so-called soft skills. And if you look at the top line, for example, communication skills made the number 1 in terms of that list. And so if you look at the frequency of how often that occurs, about 31% of all job ads that we looked at required some sort of communication skills. So for the purpose of this audience, I thought it might be interesting to sort of limit the occupations for the so-called trades occupations. So these are categories that are included in the left-hand side here. And so you can see that truck driver, etc., warehouse workers are all heavily in demand. But if you look at the red table for most commonly listed skills, you can also see that for occupations in the trades category as well, communication skills, customer service, troubleshooting, organization skills are all considered to be very, very important skills. So when we think about, what are some of the skills that are required for, occupations in the trades, category, we should also be thinking about these soft skills as well. So, of course, when we did this analysis, we also wanted to actually figure out what are some of the, effects, how do job requirements affect the time to fill? And clearly, the first result is in no way groundbreaking, right? So this is just saying that, if you are, requiring a higher degree or if you're requiring longer years of experience for the same types of jobs, it does tend to make the search more difficult, right? So, for example, if you look at the college category, for example, over here, a typical job that requires no experience but a college degree took about 36 days to fill. But if you actually require 5 years of experience, that actually makes the search a little bit longer by about 4 days. So again, clearly we actually knew that this was going to happen, but the data actually supports that. More importantly, we also looked at the relationship between the number of skills that are listed on the job ad and how easy or hard does it make for that job to be filled. You can see that there's a clear negative relationship between the number of skills listed with the time to fill. So we think that this is actually an indication that people are actually finding it easier to find jobs, or alternatively, from the firm's perspective, they're finding it easier to find qualified applicants when they actually are more specific about the job requirements. So moving on to the next topic of automation and regional employment, I do think that this is actually pretty fascinating. So this is actually a report that's based on this is actually a topic that's based on the report that was published by some of our colleagues about 18 months ago. What they did was they took a relatively conservative approach, which I'll go over what that is in a minute. They looked at how many jobs, or what are the share of the jobs that could be in high risk of being replaced by automation. So after their analysis, they found out that about 25 million jobs across the United States, or about 18% of all jobs, are at high risk of being replaced by automation. And for Philadelphia, that number is about 500,000 jobs, also about 18% of all jobs out there. So really, the key questions that they asked is, who are who will be most affected by automation, and can we say anything about the new jobs that are potentially going to be created by new jobs? So going back to the second bullet point about what approach that they took. So when we talk about automation, I think it is extremely important to think about. I think there's this common misunderstanding about how people think that automation replaces jobs. So the correct way to think about it is that automation doesn't replace jobs, right? They replace tasks. And jobs are the collection of tasks. So if enough tasks of that job are actually replaced by automation, then that job is actually replaced by automation. So, so in their approach, in their paper, what they did was, if they, given the current technology, if they estimate that 95% of the tasks that are associated with that specific occupation can be automated within the next 10 years, then that, that job is actually considered to be high risk of automation, which is actually a very conservative approach. So if you look at the literature, related literature, in the industry, the numbers that I've seen, I think the most common number I've seen are, between 70 to 80%. So, in that context, I think they're taking, basically a very sort of minimum approach. They are requiring the, more than 95% of the tasks to be, automated before they consider that job to be automated. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just a quick question. Is that thinking only in terms of robotic automation, or is it also include AI?
Both. So any type of automation, robotic automation, any type of computer, machines, etc. So, when they did their analysis, first thing that they showed us in the paper is that, they gave us a list of, some of the, top 10 largest high-risk occupations in Philadelphia. And, some of these jobs are probably not surprising. We have been hearing about this over and over again for the past couple of years or so. So cashiers, office clerks, secretaries, etc. Those occupations all have very high, probability of automation in the next decade or so. So in answering, who are the people going to be most affected by, the introduction of technology in the workforce, it's basically people who tend to have these jobs, right? So they also did some analysis in terms of, gender, ethnicity, and age, and you can clearly see that, high-risk jobs are, highly concentrated among those who are already vulnerable to, in the labor market. So these things actually, don't affect people, uniformly, meaning that not everyone has the same chance of being, automated. So we do have to start thinking about what are some of the downstream effects of, introducing technology into workforce. So in terms of, so of course, we introduce technology in the labor force because we want to develop, we want to grow, as an economy. So clearly there, people are doing this because, down the line, there's a potential, benefit there. So when we think about, what are some of the jobs that are projected to grow by the introduction of these technologies, we're seeing something interesting, right? So the way to read this graph is that if you look at the gray areas, those are the, basically the distribution of jobs that are basically at high risk jobs. And then the orange and the blue bars are the, the projected job growth, broken down by wage categories, depending on what data set that you use. So regardless of what data set you use, it does look like, the introduction of technology in the workforce does two things. So one is that it tends to replace occupations that tend to be less paid. So you can see that from the gray bar. And then those are going to be replaced by relatively higher paying jobs. So, if done correctly, in theory, it does look like, this introduction of technology is, going to bring the overall average wage rate up, again, if done correctly. In the meantime, we should be thinking about, in the meantime, when we implement these technologies, we should be thinking about, what are some of the, so-called opportunity occupations and that have, lower risk of automation. Again, the paper does provide some of the, occupations out there that have lower automation probability that pay, above median wage, and also, they don't tend to require, a four-year college degree. So again, when thinking about these, issues with automation, it does, I do think that, we should be thinking about some of the, these consequences. So with the remaining time that I have, I thought I would quickly talk about some of the what are effects of retiring workers. So just to give you before providing you with more specific statistics, I want to show you what our sort of demographic looks like in the latest available data. And it's no news that we are getting older as a nation, and you can see that if you look at the red line, which represents the share of the U.S. population that's 55 and above, you can see that that has actually increased quite a bit in the last 20 years or so, and of course with that the share of the younger population has actually gone down. And so this is for the U.S., but if you look at some of the communities, for example, right here in Philadelphia, or also Pennsylvania, as a whole, you can see that the red line has actually surpassed the blue line. So for Pennsylvania, for example, right now we actually officially have more people who are age 55 and above than the younger people who are age 25 and younger. So clearly, in terms of labor force, that is going to be very impactful. And why should we care about this? Well, because if you look at the labor force participation rate, so when we think about the long-term economic growth, one of the two deciding factors of a long-term economic growth as a nation is the growth in labor force. So really, if we have a shrinking labor force, that mathematically and automatically means that our economy will not be growing as fast as it should be. And retirement is the single largest cause of long-term declining the U.S. labor force. As you can see from this picture, we have been already seeing some evidence of declining labor force participation rate. And according to some of my colleagues in the research department, according to their research papers, we are projected to have another 2 percentage point decline in the labor force participation rates over the next decade or so. When we think about the economic growth, thinking about who is going to be in the labor force is going to be extremely important. So, what can we say about older population and the retirement? So when I was doing this research for this presentation, I actually found a pretty interesting research that was published back in 2000, and they basically tried to answer the same question that I was trying to answer, but just using the 1998 data. So we can actually compare and contrast what people thought 20 years ago, and we can actually see how can we think about retirement in the year of 2020. So back in 2000, when this study was published, median age for our workforce was about 39 years of age, and the middle column here, percentage of 45 plus, means that this is basically the share of the people who are 45 and above in that occupation. You can see that back in '98, that percentage was about 34%. So what happened 20 years later? So using the latest statistics, we can actually see that, first of all, we actually became, the data confirms that we actually became older in terms of labor force. So the median age is actually has increased by 3 years at 42 years. And also, if you look at the a percentage of 45 plus, that has actually increased by more than 10 percentage points. So really, on average, we are getting older in terms of labor force. And if you look at some of the different categories, you do see some interesting. Apparently, judges are very old. Apparently, 83% of them are 45 and above. And so, travel agents are also up there. So you could see that this has become a sort of a more important issue in the last 20 years or so. And so, for example, if you count the number of times, if you count the number of times 50 and above appears in this particular column, you see that back in 2000, only 14 of the occupations listed there actually had more than half of the that particular occupation, occupied by 45, people who are age 45 and above. Fast forward 20 years, 94 of the 500 plus occupations out there actually, had more than half a share of people who are 45 and above. So again, on average, we're getting older, and also if you look at some of the individual occupations, we're getting again older as well. So the last slide I wanted to show you was, what are some of the occupations that have the greatest need for those who are retiring? So again, I thought I will show you the data from 2000, and also give you some idea about what's going to happen for the next 10 years or so. So if you look at the distribution, if you look at the changes between the blue and the red tables, you can see first of all that the retiree replacement needs actually increased by almost threefold. Right? So back in 2000, the projected retiree replacement need was about 22 million. Right now, that number is about 72 million. So clearly, we are starting to see a very big impact of retirees. And also, what's interesting about particularly for the red table here is that even when the occupation itself is projected to shrink overall, that's indicated by the red letters, you do see pretty big replacement needs for those occupations, so cashiers, retail salespersons, etc. Because so these occupations tend to be projected to be shrinking because of introduction of technology. But while we wait for the technology to be fully implemented, we still need cashiers, we still need retail salespersons, and it does look like replacement need for the retiree is going to be pretty big. And of course, I did the same analysis where again for the trades occupations, we anecdotally hear always about how we need more plumbers, more carpenters, more electricians, and the data does seem to support. For example, carpenters, there is going to be about 327,000 carpenters that are going to retire over the next decade or so. So we do have to think about how can we actually get people to take those jobs. So I know I'm almost getting kicked out of the podium because I'm out of time, but really I just wanted to show you some statistics to get our conversation started for this morning. If we don't have time to attend to all of your questions, I'll be available throughout the day, so come find me. But with the remaining 3 minutes that I have, does anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
The automation slide?
Yep.
Try to explain the statistic, because some of them are like 97% likely to be automated. But clearly 97% of food service jobs are not going to be automated.
So again,
So I'll try to what that number meant.
yeah. So again, I think when we talk about automation, I think it's important to think about these as in terms of tasks rather than jobs. So when we say automation probability, it's saying that for a typical, so for example, cashier job, and given the technology that we have now, for the next 10 years or so, 97% of what cashiers do right now can potentially be automated. So it's not like 97% of 69,000 people are all going to lose jobs tomorrow. It's just saying that if you take a typical cashier job, on average, 97% of what they do can be potentially automated in the next 10 years. Yes, sir.
Just a brief observation. So there's a lot of moving parts. We're not talking about I guess, is it within the scope of your presentation right now to talk about the quality of these service jobs?
Yes.
Right? But anecdotally, I think we can say that many of them are lower paid.
Correct.
And so my observation is that it puts a tremendous pressure on public spending, particularly with regard to Medicaid and other types of income supports that allow people moving into these lower wage jobs to still be viable consumers and supporters of families.
Yeah, great question. I think that's one of the whole point about this conference, and hopefully that other people smarter than me in this room have answers to the question. One of the things I also would like to emphasize is that, if you look at this particular report, they do list, some of the jobs, in this context of automation, some of the jobs that are still, decently paid that they, that people can take. So again, I think you're absolutely right that, some of the jobs that are being added right now tend to be lower paid, but at the same time, there are jobs like these available to people to take. So I think one of the main points about having a discussion about apprenticeship is basically to see what we can do as employers for people to actually find these jobs appealing. There was another question back there. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, very impressive and detailed data. Thank you. I am.
Apologies. There's a microphone at each table. If you just click the button, that way the people who are watching the live stream will be able to hear.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? I was very impressed at your data and the detail and the trend and specificity of the occupations particularly. I will say I was curious in your initial assertion that the story around Philadelphia and unemployment was rosier than my understanding. So I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about that. And I'm wondering if the unemployment message is inflated by, people who aren't actively looking for jobs, who are not counted in the unemployment rate. So if the unemployment rate is very low and wages are not rising, is it because people who are sidelined are drawn back into the job market? So, the apparent unemployment rate doesn't move, yet the employment rate rises and wages remain flat. I'm trying to understand, or do single humans have multiple jobs, or do I just not understand that the employment situation is better than I understood in this city?
Great question. And so, to answer your question about, unemployment. So the headline number that you often hear is what's called the U3 number, which is in black line in front of you, and that's a number that you hear over and over again. So these are very specific people. So these are people who are out of a job, looking for a job, and most importantly, are actively searching for jobs. So there are about 6 million people out there who are in that category. But if you actually add what we call the marginally attached workers, and I think this is what your question is about, those people who are discouraged or those people who are who just don't want to look for whatever reason. And if you look at and that's represented by U6, which is a blue line out there. And again, if you look at the statistics, it does look like in both numbers, the numbers and the rates have been clearly decreasing since the last recession. Obviously, it could be lower, absolutely. But I do think that in terms of the overall macroeconomic perspective, we tend to look at the rate or the change in the rate in terms instead of the numbers, right? And another interesting statistics I should also show you is that, and I think this is part of your question about there are some population who have part-time jobs, but would rather have full-time jobs, and that number is also declining as well. So we started off at about 9 million people at the end of last recession, and that number is actually has gone down to about 4 million people. And if you look at the the historical number, you can see that the current rate is roughly where we were throughout the last expansionary period. So in terms of the what people are finding in terms of jobs, yes, I agree with the earlier questions that some of the jobs are some of these jobs are tend to be lower paid, which I think is why the wage rate isn't going as quickly as it should be. But in terms of when we think about a typical person who wants a job, does seem to be able to get a job in this economic climate. Of course, I think it's impossible to elaborate further with the -2 minutes that I have at the podium. But yeah, I think overall statistics does tend to mask the average a lot. I absolutely agree with you, which is why I think a conference like this is extremely important to hear from people who have more specific data. So again, I'll be happy to answer questions throughout the day. Just come find me. But thank you for having me here.